Thank you for clicking in this video. Welcome to a story where silence holds its breath and shadows tell their secrets. What lurks behind the creaking walls of an isolated country house? As the past unfolds and strange occurrences intensify, one question remains. Will the truth set them free, or will the darkness drive them away? Stay with us until the end to uncover the chilling fate of those who dared to confront the unknown. This is Poltergeist of the Country House.
The country house stood isolated, surrounded by vast fields of wheat stretching as far as the eye could see. The old stone structure, with its ivy-clad walls and sagging roof, looked as though it had been untouched by time. James and Laura Thompson, a couple eager for a fresh start, had decided to move here, leaving behind the hustle and bustle of city life for the tranquility of the countryside. They had fallen in love with the house the moment they saw it. It was charming, with its old-world character and sprawling gardens. But as they settled in, the house revealed a different side of itself. It began with subtle disturbances, footsteps echoing in empty rooms, and the occasional clatter of something falling without explanation. James had brushed these off as mere quirks of an old house. Laura, however, couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. One evening, while unpacking boxes in the living room, Laura noticed a picture frame lying askew on the mantelpiece. She straightened it, only for it to be crooked again moments later. She called James over to investigate, but he found nothing amiss. As the days passed, the disturbances grew more pronounced. Doors would slam shut on their own, and objects would move from their places without anyone touching them. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, and the air seemed to hum with an unsettling energy. One night, while James was working late in the study, Laura heard the faint sound of a woman's voice calling her name. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. She searched the house, but found nothing. The voice persisted, growing more urgent each night, yet always vanishing when she tried to pinpoint its source. Desperate for answers, James and Laura began researching the history of the house. They learned that it had once belonged to the Devereaux family, who had lived there in the 1950s. The family had been known for their reclusive nature, and the house had gained a reputation for being haunted after a series of mysterious events led to the brutal murder of Mr. Devereaux. The case had never been solved, and the house had been left abandoned for years before the Thompsons moved in. The discovery left them unsettled. The local historian they consulted mentioned that poltergeist activity was not uncommon in old houses with dark histories. The entity, he explained, often manifested in attempts to drive out new occupants, clinging to the traumas of the past. That night, the house felt different. A cold draft swept through the rooms, despite all the windows being tightly closed. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the whispering voice was more insistent than ever. Laura and James lay awake in bed, each hearing the same haunting calls, the same feeling of being watched. They clung to each other, their previous excitement now replaced by an unshakable dread. "Something's wrong," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. James nodded, his face pale in the moonlight streaming through the curtains. As they lay there, the house groaned and creaked, as if reacting to their fear. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. It was as if the house itself was alive, struggling to expel the intruders who had dared to uncover its secrets. The Thompsons had barely begun their new life in this isolated retreat, and already, it seemed like their peace was slipping away, replaced by the lingering terror of something unseen but profoundly malevolent. The following days were a blur of mounting anxiety for James and Laura. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind outside seemed to carry a sinister undertone. The once quaint and charming house now felt like a cage, its walls closing in with each passing hour. One morning, Laura awoke to find her bedspread twisted and tangled as if someone had been wrestling beneath it. She was alone, James already up and working on the repairs he'd been meaning to tackle. She tried to ignore the unsettling feeling, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But the disquiet she felt was relentless, like a whisper in her ear that wouldn't let go. James had started noticing strange things, too. Tools in the workshop would be misplaced, only to turn up in locations he was certain he hadn't left them. He dismissed it as forgetfulness, but when his hammer vanished from the workbench, only to reappear on the floor directly beneath, he began to question his sanity. One evening, after a long day of unpacking and fixing up the house, James and Laura decided to take a break and explore the surrounding land. They wandered through the overgrown garden and into the small, dilapidated barn at the edge of the property. Inside, they found old farming equipment covered in dust and cobwebs. Laura noticed a rusty metal box half buried in the dirt, its surface etched with strange symbols and worn with age. Curiosity piqued. James tried to pry it open, but it was stuck fast. They decided to leave it for another day, but the encounter left a lingering sense of foreboding. The barn, with its dark corners and eerie silence, seemed almost to whisper secrets of its own. That night, as they lay in bed, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. Laura, already on edge, shivered and pulled the covers closer. James was wide awake, listening to the rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to escape from within. Laura's sleep was fitful, plagued by unsettling dreams of shadowy figures and cold, empty eyes. She awoke with a start, her heart racing. The whispering voice was back, more insistent than before. It seemed to come from the direction of the barn, calling out to her in a language she couldn't understand. Unable to ignore the feeling any longer, James decided to investigate the barn late that night. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, he made his way outside. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and the barn loomed before him like a dark sentinel. As he approached, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He cursed under his breath, fumbling with the batteries, but when he looked up, the barn door was swinging slowly open. James hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel an oppressive force pushing against him, urging him to turn back. But he steeled himself and stepped inside. The barn was colder than he remembered, and the shadows seemed to dance along the walls. The metal box was still where they had left it, but now it seemed to radiate an almost palpable sense of malevolence. James approached it cautiously, and as he touched the lid, a cold wind rushed past him, extinguishing the flashlight's beam. Suddenly, he heard a noise, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness. James spun around, but saw nothing. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and he felt an icy breath against his neck. Fear surged through him, and he stumbled back, desperately trying to relight the flashlight. Just as the beam flickered back to life, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the barn, its eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Without thinking, James bolted for the door, the cold breath still lingering on his skin. He didn't stop running until he was back inside the house, slamming the door behind him. Laura was waiting for him, her face pale with worry. "James, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," James replied, trying to catch his breath. "But we need to leave this place. There's something in that barn, something we can't understand." Laura's eyes widened in fear. "We're not safe here, are we?" James didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. The house was no longer just an old building. It was a place of darkness, and they were trapped within its malevolent grasp. The following day was shrouded in a heavy, oppressive silence. James and Laura barely spoke to each other as they went about their chores. The barn, which had once been an intriguing relic of the property, now loomed over them as a symbol of their growing terror. James couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure he had seen in the barn. It haunted him, replaying over and over in his mind. He decided that they needed to understand what they were dealing with, to unravel the mystery of the house before their fear consumed them completely. Laura, though deeply unsettled, agreed. They needed answers. That afternoon, they made their way back to the barn. Despite their fear, they were determined to investigate the metal box further. The barn seemed even colder than before, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. James approached the box with a sense of dread. The eerie symbols on its surface seemed to shimmer in the dim light. He worked the crowbar around the edges, prying it open with great effort. When the lid finally gave way, an overwhelming stench of old blood and rot escaped from within. James recoiled, but Laura moved closer, her curiosity overcoming her fear. Inside the box, they found a collection of old documents and photographs, all yellowed with age. James carefully removed them, laying them out on the dusty floor. The photographs depicted scenes of the house and its previous occupants, the Devereaux family. One photo, in particular, caught Laura's eye, a portrait of Mr. Devereaux, his stern face staring directly at the camera, his eyes seeming to follow them. Laura picked up a weathered journal from the box and began to leaf through it. The pages were filled with frantic, scrawled notes. The writing was erratic and barely legible, but a few phrases stood out. They watch, the voices won't stop, and the cold breath. The entries became increasingly disjointed and paranoid, describing strange occurrences and a growing sense of dread. The final entry was a cryptic warning: beware the shadows, they hunger. As Laura read aloud, a chilling gust of wind swept through the barn, extinguishing their flashlight once again. The darkness was thick and impenetrable. James reached for his phone, using its light to illuminate the journal. The cold was unbearable, and their breath misted in the freezing air. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open slowly, as if beckoning them outside. The whispering voice that Laura had heard previously seemed to rise from the darkness, calling to them in a mournful, pleading tone. James and Laura exchanged terrified glances. "We need to get out of here," James said urgently, but Laura was already moving towards the door, drawn by the voice. "No, wait!" James shouted, but Laura was unresponsive, her eyes glazed over. He grabbed her arm and pulled her back, but she resisted, her body trembling. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe as if alive, reaching out towards them. James felt a cold, invisible hand grip his heart, tightening with every passing moment. He could see the outline of the shadowy figure again, this time more defined and menacing. Desperate, James yanked Laura away from the door, dragging her back into the barn's interior. The barn door slammed shut behind them with a resounding crash, cutting off the voice and plunging them into near-total darkness. Laura was sobbing uncontrollably, her fear palpable. James tried to comfort her, but his own terror was overwhelming. They stumbled over the cluttered floor, trying to find their way back to the door. As they moved, James felt a presence behind them, a cold and malevolent force that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Finally, they managed to find the door and escape the barn. The sunlight outside was almost blinding after the darkness, and the warmth was a welcome relief. They stood there, gasping for breath, their hearts racing. The barn behind them seemed to watch with a silent, menacing gaze. Back in the house, they reviewed their findings from the box. The journal's warnings and the photographs only added to their growing sense of dread. They realized that they had to find a way to confront the entity that haunted their home, or they would be consumed by its darkness. The house was no longer just a place of old memories and charm. It had become a battleground, and James and Laura were caught in its sinister grip. The shadows that lurked within were hungry, and they had to find a way to appease them or face the consequences. The Thompsons' resolve was tested further as they continued to experience unsettling phenomena in their home. Each night brought a new wave of terror, items appearing in different places, cold spots that seemed to follow them, and an ever-present sense of being watched. They could no longer dismiss these occurrences as mere quirks of an old house. Determined to confront the source of their fear, James and Laura decided to delve deeper into the house's history. They visited the local library, hoping to uncover more about the Devereaux family and the murder that had tainted their home. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, was familiar with the house's dark past and offered to help. As they sat across from her in the dimly lit library, Mrs. Henderson recounted the events surrounding the Devereaux family. The murder of Mr. Devereaux was particularly gruesome. He had been found dead in the barn, his body mutilated in a manner that suggested a frenzied, violent attack. The police had never found a suspect, and the case had remained cold, leaving the house with a lingering aura of malevolence. Mrs. Henderson also mentioned that the Devereaux family had been known for their secretive nature. Neighbors had reported strange noises and odd behavior, but no one had dared to investigate further. The house had been abandoned for years before James and Laura's arrival, a silent witness to the horrors it had witnessed. With this new information, James and Laura returned to the house, feeling more determined but also more apprehensive. They decided to perform a thorough search of the property, hoping to find any additional clues that might explain the house's hostility. They began in the basement, a dark, musty space that had been left largely untouched. As they descended into the basement, the air grew colder. The flickering light of their flashlight barely penetrated the darkness. The basement was filled with old furniture covered in sheets, boxes of forgotten belongings, and a workbench cluttered with rusted tools. It was here that Laura discovered something alarming, a hidden door behind a stack of old crates. The door was small and inconspicuous, almost blending into the wall. With great effort, they pried it open, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading further down. A feeling of dread washed over them as they descended into the unknown. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a small, dimly lit room. The air was heavy with the stench of decay, and the walls were lined with old, dusty shelves. On one shelf, they found a collection of peculiar items, old dolls with cracked faces, faded photographs, and various trinkets that seemed out of place. Among these items, Laura found a small, ornate box. It was intricately carved with strange symbols and patterns. The box was locked, but Laura managed to pry it open with a screwdriver. Inside, they found a bundle of old letters, their yellowed pages filled with frantic writing. The letters were addressed to a mysterious recipient, and their content revealed a troubled mind. The writer spoke of a growing sense of paranoia and fear, describing voices that tormented him and shadows that seemed to come alive. The letters hinted at a hidden, sinister force within the house, something that sought to claim its inhabitants. As Laura read the letters aloud, a sudden, violent gust of wind blew through the basement, extinguishing their flashlight and plunging them into darkness. The temperature plummeted, and the sense of malevolence grew stronger. Shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, and the whispering voices returned, louder and more urgent than before. James and Laura huddled together, their breath visible in the freezing air. They could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, though no one was visible. The small room seemed to close in on them, the walls pressing in with a suffocating pressure. In a desperate bid to escape, James grabbed Laura's hand and led her back up the stairs. The narrow staircase seemed to twist and turn, making their climb feel endless. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the shadows seemed to follow them every step of the way. When they finally emerged into the basement, they slammed the hidden door shut behind them, their hearts racing. The oppressive atmosphere of the basement lingered, even as they made their way back to the main house. Exhausted and shaken, they sat in the living room, the chilling discovery weighing heavily on their minds. The letters had confirmed their worst fears. The house was not just haunted, it was alive with a malevolent force that had been waiting for them. The sense of dread that had pervaded their home was a manifestation of something ancient and angry, a force that had claimed the house as its own. As they looked around at the familiar surroundings, the comfort of their new home seemed to have vanished. The house, once a symbol of their fresh start, had become a prison. The shadows that lurked within were not merely the figments of their imagination, they were real, and they were hungry for something more than just fear. The days that followed were marked by a growing sense of dread. James and Laura felt like prisoners in their own home, the once comforting walls now seeming to close in on them. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on them, and their nights were plagued by restless sleep and eerie noises. Determined to get some answers, James reached out to a local historian, Dr. Robert Harris, who had expertise in the history of the region and its haunted past. Dr. Harris agreed to meet with them and hear about their experiences. That evening, Dr. Harris arrived at the house. He was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, but there was an intensity in his eyes as he listened to their account. As James and Laura described their experiences and showed him the items they had found in the basement, Dr. Harris's interest deepened. Dr. Harris explained that the house had a dark reputation in local folklore. It was said to be built on land with a history of violence and unrest, predating the Devereux family. According to local legend, the area had once been the site of a brutal massacre during the English Civil War. The land was believed to be cursed, and the house, built over this cursed ground, was said to be a magnet for malevolent spirits. James and Laura were both intrigued and horrified. They had hoped for some rational explanation, but the historical context only deepened their fear. Dr. Harris agreed to perform a more thorough investigation of the house, using his knowledge of local legends and historical records to piece together the full story. Over the next few days, Dr. Harris conducted his investigation, frequently visiting the house and speaking with locals. He uncovered records of previous occupants who had experienced similar disturbances, and his findings only confirmed what James and Laura had suspected. The house was plagued by a dark and vengeful presence. With each passing day, the Thompsons' situation grew more desperate. The disturbances in their home became increasingly violent and frequent. The house seemed to be alive, reacting to their every move with a malevolent energy. James and Laura felt as though they were constantly on edge, their nerves frayed by the unrelenting terror. Determined to find a solution, they reached out to Dr. Harris for further assistance. His initial investigation had uncovered some of the house's dark history, but they needed more concrete answers. Dr. Harris agreed to perform a seance to communicate with the entity that haunted their home, hoping to gain insight into its intentions and find a way to pacify it. That evening, Dr. Harris arrived with an assortment of occult tools and artifacts, including candles, incense, and a set of antique spirit boards. He set up the seance in the living room, which had become the focal point of the house's paranormal activity. The room was dimly lit, the flickering candlelight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. James and Laura sat on opposite sides of the table, their faces pale with anxiety. Dr. Harris took his place at the head of the table, positioning the spirit board between them. He began the ritual by lighting the candles and invoking protective incantations. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as he prepared to make contact with the entity. As Dr. Harris started to ask questions, the room grew colder and a sense of foreboding settled over them. The planchette on the spirit board began to move slowly, guided by an unseen force. The messages it spelled out were fragmented and cryptic: leave, fear, not alone. James and Laura watched in horror as the planchette's movements grew more erratic. The responses were becoming increasingly aggressive, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a palpable tension. The whispers they had heard before now filled the room, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo from every corner. Dr. Harris tried to calm the entity, urging it to communicate more clearly. But as he did, the temperature in the room plummeted, and a violent gust of wind blew through the house, extinguishing the candles and plunging them into darkness. The oppressive energy grew heavier, suffocating. In the pitch-black room, James and Laura could hear the sound of furniture being overturned and objects crashing to the floor. The whispers had turned into a deafening roar, and the shadows on the walls seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent life. Panic set in as the room seemed to close in on them. James grabbed Laura's hand and tried to find their way out, but the darkness was impenetrable. The house seemed to be shifting, the familiar layout now disorienting and labyrinthine. The oppressive force felt as though it was physically pushing against them, making every movement a struggle. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, revealing the room in a state of chaos. The spirit board was shattered, and the candles had been extinguished. Dr. Harris sat in the middle of the wreckage, his face pale and shaken. He had managed to retain some composure, but the intensity of the encounter had clearly taken its toll. "That was intense," Dr. Harris said, his voice trembling. "The entity is extremely hostile. It doesn't want us here, and it's feeding off our fear." James and Laura were both stunned and terrified. They had hoped for answers, but the seance had only deepened their sense of dread. The entity's messages had been clear: it wanted them gone, and it was willing to go to any lengths to drive them away. Dr. Harris advised them to take a break and try to regroup. He suggested that they consider leaving the house, at least temporarily, to give themselves a chance to recover. He also recommended reaching out to a more experienced paranormal investigator who might have additional methods for dealing with such a powerful presence. As James and Laura sat in their now dismantled living room, the weight of their predicament was heavy. The house, once a dream of a new beginning, had become a nightmare. The entity that haunted them was relentless, and their efforts to uncover its secrets had only intensified its hostility. They knew they had to act quickly. The house was no longer a safe place, and their very lives were at stake. The echoes of the past were not just whispers, they were a living, breathing force, and they were determined to make their presence known. As they prepared to leave the house, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lift slightly, but the sense of foreboding remained. They had to find a way to confront the darkness that lurked within their home, or risk being consumed by it entirely. One night, as James and Laura attempted to rest, they heard a loud crash coming from the basement. Their hearts raced as they grabbed a flashlight and cautiously descended the stairs. The basement was dark and cold, and the air was thick with a stifling silence. The hidden door, which they had carefully closed, was now ajar. James pushed the door open, revealing the narrow staircase leading down to the small room. The sight that met them was chilling. The room was in disarray, the items on the shelves had been scattered, and the letters from the ornate box were strewn across the floor. The box itself was missing. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she noticed something even more disturbing. The shadowy figure from James's previous encounter seemed to be moving among the shadows in the room, its form shifting and writhing. The air was filled with an almost tangible malevolence, and the temperature had dropped significantly. Desperate to understand what was happening, James and Laura began to search for the missing box. They scoured the basement, but it was as if the shadows themselves were working against them, obscuring their vision and making every corner of the room seem more ominous. Just as they were about to give up, a faint, eerie light appeared in the corner of the room. It was coming from beneath an old, dusty rug. James lifted the rug to reveal a trapdoor. With trembling hands, he pried it open, revealing a small, hidden compartment beneath the floor. Inside the compartment was the ornate box, its lid slightly open. James reached for it, but as soon as his fingers touched the box, a cold, oppressive force seemed to surge through the room. The shadowy figure materialized more clearly, its eyes glowing with an intense, malevolent light. Laura screamed, clutching James's arm. The figure advanced towards them, its form coalescing into something both terrifying and grotesque. The whispers that had haunted them were now a cacophony of voices, screaming and wailing in a language they couldn't understand. In a panic, James slammed the trapdoor shut and grabbed Laura, pulling her back towards the stairs. They fled the basement, their footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. As they reached the main floor, they slammed the basement door shut behind them, their hearts pounding in their chests. They stood in the living room, panting and shaken. The oppressive atmosphere had returned, the house now feeling even more hostile than before. Dr. Harris's investigation had only scratched the surface of the house's dark history, and the presence that haunted them seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The house was no longer just an old building with a sinister past. It had become an active force, determined to drive them away. The shadows that lurked within were not just remnants of the past, they were alive, hungry for something more than fear. As James and Laura looked around at their home, the sense of unease was palpable. They were trapped in a nightmare, with no clear way to escape. The house was no longer just a place of refuge, it was a battleground, and they were caught in the middle of its ancient, malevolent struggle. James and Laura huddled together in the living room, their nerves on edge as the house seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, weaving through the rooms like a tangible force. The entity was no longer content with mere disturbances, it had escalated its efforts to drive them away. The shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and shift, their dark forms taking on grotesque shapes. The temperature continued to plummet, and the chill in the air was so intense it felt like it was seeping into their very bones. Every creak of the house and every flicker of the lights seemed to be a warning, a reminder of the malevolent presence that was waiting for them. Desperate to find some semblance of peace, James decided to take a walk through the house. He hoped that by familiarizing himself with every corner, he might gain some control over the chaotic environment. Armed with a flashlight, he ventured into the dimly lit hallways, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. As he moved through the house, he noticed that certain rooms seemed colder than others. The temperature variations were extreme, and he could feel the icy breath of the entity in the areas where it was strongest. The sounds of creaking floorboards and whispering voices seemed to follow him, a constant reminder of the entity's presence. He stopped in the study, where Dr. Harris had conducted his research. The room, cluttered with old documents and historical records, felt particularly oppressive. The shadows in the room seemed to close in on him, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. James scanned the room, his eyes falling on a stack of old books and newspapers. Among them was a journal with a faded leather cover. Curiosity piqued, he carefully opened it, revealing pages filled with cramped handwriting. The entries were dated from the 1950s and described the lives of the Devereaux family, their struggles, and their eventual demise. The final entries were disturbing, detailing the growing sense of fear and paranoia that had plagued the family. It seemed that the family had been tormented by an unseen presence long before the murders occurred. The journal spoke of strange noises, objects moving on their own, and an ever-present feeling of being watched. James's heart raced as he read the entries. It was clear that the Devereaux family had experienced the same kind of terror that he and Laura were now enduring. The entity that haunted the house was not just a figment of imagination, it was a real and malevolent force with a history of violence and fear. Suddenly, the lights in the study flickered violently before going out completely, plunging the room into darkness. James's flashlight flickered as well, casting long, erratic shadows on the walls. He felt a cold hand grip his shoulder, and he spun around, only to find nothing there. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to find the source of the cold touch. The whispers grew louder, and the air felt as though it were constricting around him. James stumbled out of the study, desperately trying to find Laura. The oppressive energy in the house was suffocating, and he felt as though he were being pulled in different directions by an unseen force. He found Laura in the living room, her face pale and filled with fear. She had been experiencing her own horrors, with objects moving on their own and strange shadows appearing at the edges of her vision. The house seemed to be closing in on them, its malevolent presence more tangible than ever. Dr. Harris joined them, his face drawn and serious. "We need to act quickly," he said. "The entity is growing stronger, and it's feeding off your fear. We have to find a way to confront it directly." Dr. Harris led them to the basement, where he believed the source of the entity's power might be hidden. The basement was damp and dark, filled with the musty smell of decay. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the walls seemed to close in around them. In the basement, Dr. Harris began to perform a series of rituals and incantations, attempting to establish a connection with the entity and gain control over its power. James and Laura watched anxiously, their nerves frayed by the constant sense of danger. As Dr. Harris worked, the temperature in the basement dropped even further, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the shadows took on sinister forms. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash, and the entire basement seemed to shake. The ritual had triggered a violent reaction from the entity, and the air was filled with a whirlwind of shadows and cold. James and Laura struggled to stay on their feet as the entity's power surged around them. Dr. Harris continued his work, his voice rising above the chaos. "We have to hold on," he shouted. "We're close to breaking through." The intensity of the encounter was overwhelming. James and Laura clung to each other, their fear mingling with a sense of desperate hope. The house was fighting back, but they had to endure if they wanted to find a solution. As the chaos reached its peak, the energy in the basement suddenly shifted. The oppressive force seemed to retreat, and the temperature began to rise. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Dr. Harris collapsed, exhausted but determined. "We've made some progress," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But this isn't over. The entity is still here, and we need to be prepared for whatever comes next." James and Laura were left shaken but resolute. They had faced a powerful and malevolent force, and they knew that their battle was far from over. The house still held its dark secrets, and the entity's anger was far from quenched. As they prepared to face whatever came next, they knew that their struggle was only beginning. The entity's grip on the house was strong, and they would need all their courage and determination to confront the darkness and reclaim their home. The eerie calm that followed the basement confrontation did little to reassure James and Laura. The oppressive silence in the house seemed even more menacing after the tumultuous battle with the entity. Dr. Harris had insisted they stay another night, arguing that leaving now could risk their safety. Reluctantly, James and Laura agreed, feeling that their fight was far from over. The house, now eerily quiet, felt like a trap. Each room they entered seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next upheaval. They could still sense the dark energy that permeated every corner, and despite their exhaustion, sleep was elusive. Every creak of the floorboards and whisper of wind outside seemed amplified in the dead silence. The following morning, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Dr. Harris was determined to continue his investigation and hoped that additional research would reveal more about the entity's origins. He had enlisted the help of local historians and paranormal experts, but the process was slow, and each passing hour seemed to stretch the limits of their patience. Laura had taken to exploring the house more thoroughly, trying to understand its layout and uncover any hidden secrets. She hoped that by familiarizing herself with the house, she might find something that could offer a clue or at least provide a sense of control. Her search led her to a small attic room, which had been largely ignored until now. The attic was dusty and filled with forgotten relics, old furniture, broken toys, and boxes of neglected items. Among the clutter, Laura found a small, ornate chest. It was locked, but a nearby set of old keys caught her eye. After a moment of hesitation, she selected a key and tried it in the chest's lock. To her surprise, it turned with a satisfying click. Inside the chest, Laura discovered a collection of photographs and letters from the 1950s. The photographs showed the Devereaux family in happier times, their smiles frozen in sepia tones. The letters were addressed to various family members and contained details about their lives, but what caught Laura's attention was a set of correspondences between Mr. Devereaux and an unknown correspondent. The letters hinted at troubling events and a growing sense of paranoia. One letter, in particular, was unsettling. It spoke of a deep-seated fear and an ancient presence that Mr. Devereaux believed was haunting their home. The letter described strange occurrences and a growing sense of dread, mirroring the experiences James and Laura had been enduring. Laura brought the letters and photographs to Dr. Harris, who examined them with a furrowed brow. "These documents could be crucial," he said. "They might provide insights into the entity's nature and its connection to the Devereaux family." The rest of the day was spent poring over the newly discovered materials. Dr. Harris, James, and Laura analyzed the letters and photographs, searching for patterns or connections that might explain the entity's behavior. The correspondence painted a picture of increasing fear and isolation, as if the family had been slowly driven mad by the presence that haunted them. As nightfall approached, the house began to feel increasingly oppressive. The whispers returned, more persistent than before. James and Laura tried to ignore the unsettling noises and focus on the task at hand, but their nerves were on edge. The entity seemed to be reacting to their renewed efforts, its presence growing stronger and more invasive. During dinner, the lights flickered erratically, and the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The disturbances were more intense than usual, as if the house were protesting their presence. The dining room seemed to close in on them, and the shadows appeared to stretch and writhe on the walls. Dr. Harris tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but his own anxiety was evident. "We need to prepare ourselves," he said. "The entity is becoming more aggressive. It's reacting to our investigation, and it's likely to intensify its efforts to drive us away." As the evening wore on, the disturbances escalated. Objects moved on their own, and the whispers grew louder and more insistent. James and Laura struggled to maintain their composure, but the fear was palpable. The house seemed to be a living entity, its walls and shadows conspiring against them. The culmination of the night's terror came when a loud crash echoed through the house. James and Laura raced to the source of the noise, only to find that an old mirror in the hallway had shattered into 1,000 pieces. The shards were scattered across the floor, reflecting the flickering light in a chaotic dance of broken images. Dr. Harris was at a loss. "The entity is trying to fracture our perception," he said. "It's using fear and chaos as a weapon." Determined to confront the entity, James, Laura, and Dr. Harris decided to set up a makeshift base in the living room where they could monitor the house's activity. They placed cameras and recording equipment throughout the house, hoping to capture evidence of the entity's behavior and gain further insights into its nature. As they settled in for the night, the tension was palpable. The house was quiet, but the silence was heavy with anticipation. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The cameras recorded their surroundings, capturing every flicker of shadow and every whisper of sound. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply, and the whispers returned, louder and more menacing. The cameras picked up strange anomalies, fleeting shadows, distorted images, and a cold mist that seemed to swirl through the rooms. The entity was not merely a ghost or a poltergeist, it was something much more sinister. Its anger and hostility were palpable, and its desire to drive them away was relentless. The house had become a battleground, and the entity's power was growing stronger by the hour. As dawn approached, James and Laura were exhausted but resolute. They knew that their fight was far from over, and the house's dark secrets were still waiting to be uncovered. The entity's grip on the house was strong, but they were determined to confront it and find a way to reclaim their home. The day ahead promised more challenges and revelations, and James and Laura braced themselves for whatever came next. The shadows of the past were closing in, and the battle against the darkness was only beginning. The morning sun cast a faint, cold light through the dirty windows of the house, offering little comfort against the oppressive atmosphere. James, Laura, and Dr. Harris had barely slept, and the night's evidence provided only more questions rather than answers. Their resolve was unshaken, but they knew that the entity's power was not to be underestimated. Dr. Harris, with the help of the materials Laura had found in the attic, began to piece together a more comprehensive picture of the Devereaux family's experiences. The documents hinted at a family torn apart by fear and paranoia, with the entity seeming to feed off their distress. The more they learned, the clearer it became that the entity had a personal vendetta, one deeply rooted in the house's tragic past. Laura and James took the opportunity to check the house's exterior, hoping that understanding the land and its surroundings might offer some insight. They walked around the property, noting the overgrown garden and the dilapidated outbuildings. The isolation of the house only seemed to amplify the sense of foreboding that clung to the place. As they examined the old barn at the edge of the property, Laura stumbled upon a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside, they found more documents, including property deeds and records of past owners. The records revealed that the house had changed hands frequently in the decades following the Devereaux murders, with each new owner leaving quickly under mysterious circumstances. The revelation of these records added a new layer to their understanding of the house's dark history. It was clear that the entity had driven away everyone who had come to live there, using fear and intimidation as its weapons. James and Laura realized that they were not merely dealing with a restless spirit, but with a powerful entity that thrived on the terror it created. Back inside, Dr. Harris began to prepare a more elaborate ritual, one he hoped would finally confront the entity and put an end to its reign of terror. He gathered various components, herbs, symbols, and incantations that he believed would challenge the entity's power. As night fell, the house grew eerily quiet. The temperature dropped, and the whispers began to grow louder again. James, Laura, and Dr. Harris gathered in the living room, where the ritual was to take place. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to gather in anticipation. Dr. Harris began the ritual, his voice steady but filled with a sense of urgency. The incantations echoed through the room, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and twist as if trying to escape the ritual's influence. James and Laura watched as the entity's presence became more palpable. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, their words a mix of anger and sorrow. Objects in the room began to move on their own, and the temperature dropped even further. Dr. Harris continued the ritual, his voice rising in intensity. He recited the ancient incantations with fervor, attempting to force the entity to reveal itself. The house seemed to tremble with the power of the ritual, and the shadows grew darker and more menacing. Suddenly, there was a loud, deafening crash. The walls of the living room shook, and the lights went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and the entity's presence became overwhelming. James and Laura could feel the malevolent energy pressing in on them, and they struggled to maintain their composure. In the pitch-black room, Dr. Harris's voice could still be heard, his incantations growing more urgent. The whispers turned into a roar, and the temperature plummeted to an unbearable cold. The shadows seemed to converge on them, and the air was filled with a sense of impending doom. Just when it seemed like the entity's power would overcome them, there was a blinding flash of light. The house was momentarily illuminated, and the shadows were pushed back. The oppressive energy seemed to dissipate, and the temperature slowly began to rise. Dr. Harris collapsed, exhausted but triumphant. "We did it," he said, his voice barely audible. "The entity has been driven back, but we must remain vigilant. It may return, and we need to be prepared." James and Laura, though physically and emotionally drained, felt a glimmer of hope. The house, while still filled with an unsettling presence, was no longer under the immediate threat of the entity. They had faced the darkness and survived, but they knew that their fight was far from over. The following days were spent repairing the damage and cleaning up the remnants of their harrowing experience. The house, though still haunted by its dark past, seemed to have a less oppressive air. The whispers and disturbances were less frequent, and the oppressive energy had eased. Dr. Harris continued his research, hoping to uncover more about the entity's origins and find a permanent solution. James and Laura, meanwhile, began to rebuild their lives, their experience leaving an indelible mark on them. The house, though still a place of dark memories, had become a symbol of their strength and resilience. As they looked toward the future, they knew that the entity's grip on the house was not completely gone. The shadows of the past would always linger, but they were determined to face whatever came next with courage and resolve. The battle against the darkness had been a hard-fought one, and the scars of their ordeal would serve as a reminder of the strength they had found within themselves. The house, with its dark history and lingering presence, would continue to be a place of unease. But for James and Laura, it was now a place where they had faced their fears and emerged victorious. They knew that their story was not over and that the shadows of the past would always be a part of their lives. The passage of time brought a semblance of normalcy to the house, but its dark past continued to cast a long shadow over James and Laura's lives. Though the entity's immediate threat seemed to have receded, the echoes of its malevolent presence lingered. Dr. Harris's research revealed that the house had been a site of repeated hauntings and paranormal activity, each event adding to the house's sinister reputation. James and Laura found solace in small routines, trying to rebuild their lives as best as they could. They began to fix up the house, focusing on renovations that would help them feel more at home. Yet, despite their best efforts, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something still lingered in the corners of their lives. One evening, as they were sorting through more of the attic's forgotten belongings, Laura discovered a leather-bound journal tucked away in a hidden compartment. The journal was old, its pages yellowed with age. It belonged to Evelyn Devereaux, the daughter of the family that had been murdered. The entries in Evelyn's journal were filled with a sense of dread and foreboding. She wrote about strange occurrences in the house, the growing sense of being watched, and her parents' increasing paranoia. Her last few entries were fragmented and desperate, detailing her fear of an ancient presence that seemed to be closing in on them. James and Laura read through the journal with a growing sense of unease. Evelyn's descriptions matched their own experiences, but her final entry was particularly chilling. It mentioned a hidden room within the house, one that Evelyn believed was the source of the entity's power. The entry was abruptly cut off, with the last few words hinting at something terrifying lurking in the shadows. Determined to uncover the truth, James and Laura searched the house for any signs of the hidden room. They revisited the attic and basement, examining every nook and cranny. After hours of searching, they discovered a hidden trapdoor in the basement, concealed beneath a rotting rug. With trepidation, they pried open the trapdoor and descended into a narrow, dust-filled passage. The air was musty and cold, and the passage led to a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with strange symbols and markings, and the floor was covered in old, tattered remnants of what appeared to be ritualistic items. As they explored the room, James found an old book lying on a small pedestal. The book was bound in leather, and its pages were filled with occult symbols and arcane writings. Laura flipped through the pages, and the contents revealed a disturbing truth. The entity was not merely a ghost, but a manifestation of ancient malevolence, summoned through dark rituals performed in the house. The realization was both horrifying and enlightening. The entity's presence was not just a result of the Devereaux family's murder, but was tied to deeper, more ancient forces. The house had been a site of occult activity long before the Devereaux had moved in, and the entity's power had been amplified by the rituals performed there. Armed with this new knowledge, James and Laura contacted Dr. Harris, who arrived with a renewed sense of urgency. The discovery of the hidden room in the book provided crucial insights into the entity's nature. Dr. Harris explained that the ancient rituals had created a powerful link between the entity and the house, and breaking this link would be crucial to ending its reign of terror. Dr. Harris proposed a final, more intense ritual to sever the connection between the entity and the house. The ritual involved cleansing the house of its dark history and performing a series of rites to dispel the lingering malevolent presence. It was a dangerous and complex procedure, but it was the only way to ensure the entity could no longer influence their lives. As night fell, James, Laura, and Dr. Harris prepared for the final ritual. The house, though quieter than before, still felt heavy with anticipation. They gathered in the hidden room, where Dr. Harris began the ritual with solemn precision. The ancient symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and the air was filled with a sense of foreboding. The ritual commenced with the chanting of ancient incantations and the burning of ritualistic herbs. The temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows seemed to writhe and twist in response to the ritual's power. The entity's presence was palpable, and the whispers grew louder, as if protesting the ritual's interference. As the ritual reached its climax, the room was engulfed in a blinding light. The shadows recoiled, and the oppressive energy seemed to dissipate. The temperature slowly returned to normal, and the whispers faded into an eerie silence. The ritual had succeeded in severing the entity's connection to the house, but the ordeal had taken its toll on everyone involved. Dr. Harris, though exhausted, was relieved. "We've done it," he said. "The entity's power has been broken. The house should be free of its influence." James and Laura, though weary, felt a sense of relief. The house, while still a place of dark memories, seemed to have been cleansed of its most malevolent presence. They knew that the scars of their experience would remain, but they also knew that they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. As they looked toward the future, James and Laura were determined to make the house a home once more. The shadows of the past would always linger, but they were ready to face whatever came next with courage and resolve. The house, though forever marked by its dark history, was now a testament to their strength and resilience. The final ritual had brought closure to their harrowing experience, but the echoes of the past would always be a part of their lives. James and Laura were ready to embrace their new beginning, knowing that the shadows of the past had been confronted and, for now, vanquished. With the entity's influence seemingly broken, James and Laura found themselves slowly adjusting to their new reality. The house, though still haunted by its history, felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The once oppressive atmosphere had given way to a tentative peace, and the shadows that clung to the corners of their home no longer seemed as menacing. Life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. James and Laura spent their days cleaning up and repairing the house, focusing on making it a place of comfort rather than dread. They redecorated the rooms, painted over the marks on the walls, and filled the space with the warmth of their presence. Yet, despite their efforts, they couldn't entirely shake the feeling that the house's past was always lurking just beneath the surface. Dr. Harris continued his research into the house's history, seeking to understand the full extent of the entity's origins and influence. His findings confirmed that the entity had been an ancient, malevolent force tied to the house through centuries of occult practices. The rituals performed in the hidden room had only strengthened its power, making it a formidable presence. James and Laura found solace in their newfound knowledge and in the knowledge that they had faced the darkness and survived. They began to share their story with others, hoping to shed light on the house's dark past and help others who might find themselves in similar situations. They became advocates for those dealing with paranormal experiences, using their ordeal as a way to offer support and guidance. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, reflecting on their journey, Laura brought up the idea of a fresh start. "Maybe it's time for us to create new memories here," she said softly. "We've faced so much, and we've come out stronger. This house, despite everything, can be a place of hope." James agreed, and they decided to host a small gathering with friends and family, hoping to bring joy and light to the house. They invited those closest to them to celebrate their victory over the darkness and to mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The gathering was a heartwarming success. Friends and family filled the house with laughter and cheer, their presence a testament to the strength and resilience of James and Laura. The house, once a place of terror, was now alive with the energy of companionship and celebration. As the evening drew to a close, James and Laura stood on the porch, looking out over the property. The night was calm, and the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The shadows of the past had not been entirely erased, but they were no longer the dominant force in their lives. Dr. Harris, who had attended the gathering, approached them with a reassuring smile. "You've done well," he said. "The house may still hold echoes of its past, but you faced the darkness with bravery and strength. You've made this place your own." James and Laura nodded, their hearts filled with gratitude. They knew that the house's history would always be a part of them, but they were determined to create a future free from the shadows of their past. As they returned inside, the house seemed to embrace them with a newfound warmth. The oppressive energy had dissipated, leaving behind a sense of hope and renewal. James and Laura knew that their journey was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever came next with courage and resilience. The house, with its dark history and lingering presence, had become a symbol of their strength. They had confronted the darkness and emerged victorious, and they were ready to build a new future, one filled with hope and possibility. Months passed since the entity's influence had been broken, and James and Laura settled into a routine that allowed them to enjoy the house without fear. The shadows that once plagued their lives had receded, and the house became a place of healing and renewal. Yet, as they continued to live their lives, an unexpected discovery would bring their journey full circle. One crisp autumn day, as James was working in the garden, he uncovered a small, weathered box buried beneath the overgrown foliage. The box was old, its surface covered in dirt and grime. Intrigued, James carefully opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs and letters. The photographs depicted various scenes from the house's history, including images of the Devereaux family and previous owners. Among the photographs were several that stood out, images of the house in different stages of decay, and one particularly unsettling picture of a dark, shadowy figure standing in the background. Laura joined James, and together they examined the contents of the box. The letters were written in a mix of elegant script and frantic scrawl, detailing the experiences of those who had lived in the house. One letter, dated from the 1950s, was addressed to a person named Richard, the supposed lover of Evelyn Devereaux. It spoke of hidden secrets and unfinished business. As they read through the letters, they discovered a shocking revelation. The entity was not merely a manifestation of malevolence, but was connected to a secret affair and a tragic betrayal. Evelyn Devereaux's lover, Richard, had been involved in dark rituals in a desperate attempt to save her, but his actions had only amplified the entity's power. The discovery of the box and its contents brought a new layer of understanding to their ordeal. The house's history was intertwined with personal betrayal and dark secrets, which had fueled the entity's malevolence. James and Laura realized that the house's true curse was not just the presence of the entity, but the unresolved conflicts and pain of those who had lived there. Determined to bring closure, James and Laura contacted Dr. Harris, who helped them organize a final, symbolic ceremony to honor the memory of the Devereaux family and those who had suffered in the house. The ceremony was held in the garden, where they buried the photographs and letters as a tribute to the past. As they completed the ceremony, they felt a sense of peace. The house, though still marked by its history, seemed to have found a measure of solace. The lingering shadows had been addressed, and the truth of the past had been acknowledged. James and Laura knew that their journey had come to an end, but the lessons they had learned would stay with them forever. The house, once a place of terror, had become a testament to their resilience and courage. They had faced the darkness, uncovered the truth, and emerged stronger. With a renewed sense of hope, they looked forward to the future, knowing that they had turned the house into a place of light and possibility. The shadows of the past would always be a part of their lives, but they were ready to embrace whatever came next with strength and determination. The house, with its dark history and enduring presence, had been transformed by their journey. It was now a symbol of their triumph over adversity, a place where they could build a new future free from the shadows that had once haunted their lives.
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.